I'm the Reverend Kwame Pitts, a pastor in the upstate New York Synod, and this is my reflection on racial justice and social equity in these days and these times. One of the things that was very clear to me was the transfiguration moment, I think, for this entire country, when George Floyd was murdered. For many of us who are of African descent, who are serving in various congregations around the ELCA, this was that moment when we were able to be public and witness and cry out that the racism that we had seen both in the streets and in our churches now had come to a destructive point. A man laying in the street, crying out to his mother, seeing his mother beyond the veil, seeing his ancestors asking for help, was so prophetic. And how this country somehow was moved. Ever since Trayvon Martin's death, we have been crying out in the streets, and suddenly with George Floyd, suddenly the floodgates have been opened. For many of us, to preach from the pulpit means we were also faced with a lot of discrimination and sometimes even hatred. People who were angry and pissed off that we were actually being prophetic, that we were being truthful, that we were being real, that we were being open, that we refused to sing those kumbaya moments that this church has long asked us to do. The hurt and the pain of many of my colleagues and my elders in this church have experienced. Not having calls that were fruitful, not having calls where they were allowed to be authentic, not having calls where they were respected. It was that same wound opened up. And now we are fighting. We are fighting. We're fighting for liberation and for freedom and for justice and equity and equality. For me, as a woman of African descent growing up in this church since the age of 12, I was always seen as that model citizen, that model minority, with my light skin and my fair eyes that I would just go into, be a part of, sing that kumbaya. But when I speak and open my mouth, people realize I'm speaking on behalf of my ancestors, my elders. Family members who have told me stories about growing up in the South and having to use the back door of a post office just to get their mail. Worried about my 19-year-old son and whether or not someone will think he's a thug. My son loves anime and soccer and music and all the things. Worried about my husband who is always questioning whether he's a janitor when my husband holds 2 degrees. And my family, especially my daughter, coming to the terms where they don't want to be in Christianity anymore because it doesn't fuel their soul. It leaves them traumatized. And they're worried about me as mother, as a wife, serving in a congregation that doesn't look like me, that maybe just doesn't get the reasons why I speak that racism is a sin, that white supremacy is a sin, that white nationalism is a sin. And yet we as the church, we who claim to follow Jesus Christ, now have an opportunity in a moment to turn that on its head, to speak a thing that what it is, to be those theologians of the cross, and be bold enough to begin to break away at the empire that accepts racism and violence and oppression and subjugation. A couple of months ago, actually, I think a couple of years ago, one of my friends said that she felt like the atmosphere was changing. Something had been broken open. And change was coming. And I think in that moment that George Floyd cried out to his mother, that's when that moment happened. That's when something broke open. What are we called to do? If we claim to follow Luther in this church, then we have to be bold enough to go to the places of the empire, put on the doors, all the things that are wrong and all things we will not accept. And I think for this church to understand that we of African descent, of the African diaspora, Native, indigenous peoples, we will no longer be silent, we will not back down, we will not preach a feel-good good news. We will be authentically who God has called us to be. We are the future of this church. And the future is transformation, radical revolutionary transformation. Ache.